Origin Chance, and this is Eastern Front of World War I, animated 1941, by the channel Eastory. In the summer of 1941, German army was the strongest in Europe and was preparing to use its superiority. Seriously though, German army was the strongest in Europe, even though because of, all the Treaty of Versailles and things basically, crippled them. Hitler turned it all around, right? He slowly just built up his army that he was the strongest in Europe. That is just effed up. He was preparing to use his superiority to defeat the Soviet Union in a 3-month lightning campaign. Yeah, sure. Everybody, Napoleon thought it's going to be lightning campaign. Hitler thought it was going to be lightning campaign. Yeah, it's not going to be. The Soviets, on the other hand, were preparing for a long war, like they usually do, and had built up a strong war economy. But the modernization and expansion of the Red Army was still underway, and its methods and organization were not yet fully tested in battle. Can the Wehrmacht damage the Soviet Union enough to prevent a recovery, or can the Soviets hold until their long-term advantages start to have a strong impact on the war? Yeah, I think we all know that, obviously Germans lost. Right, Napoleon did the same shit, like, oh, we're going to take the Berlin and they're going to give up. Yeah, no, not Berlin, sorry, Moscow. I'm getting confused. Napoleon thought we're going to take the Moscow and they're going to give up. Yeah, they didn't at that time. They're not going to do it here too with the Nazis. So yeah, let's go this one.
Europe, summer 1941. Germany had secured most of Central and Western Europe, with only Great Britain remaining defiant.
Yeah, alright. First of all, I saw Germany like that, like, huh? But yeah, there it is. Oh, wait a minute. They took France.
On the islands. The only potential threat to Germany in Europe was its former ally, the Soviet Union. In order to break the stalemate with Britain and make Germany's strategic position indisputable, Hitler decided to cripple the military capabilities of the Soviet Union and seize its natural resources. Germany planned to achieve this goal by capturing most of the European part of the Soviet Union before the onset of winter 1941. The main attack would take place in the center and be directed towards Moscow, with auxiliary attacks in the north and south. By the middle of June 1941, the Germans had almost completed the preparations and the invasion was about to begin. Meanwhile, the Soviet forces were unaware of what was coming and were ill-prepared to resist the German invasion. First, we'll look at the southern sector. The Soviets had deployed their strongest units in the south.
Hitler has always used that tactic, right? What is called blitzkrieg, surprise attacks suddenly with all the force that they can muster. So basically, either it just ends decisively or it's a massive blow early on.
Having 1,200,000 men between the Pripyat marches and the Black Sea, they were to be confronted by the Army Group South that was of roughly the same strength. The first objective of the Axis troops was securing the western Ukraine. On June 22nd, the invasion began. The Soviets immediately gathered their armored forces and met the German spearhead with a massive counterattack in the area of Dubno and Brody. But due to the lack of combat readiness of the units involved, it failed, and the Soviets lost most of their tanks. The German advance continued, and this created a threat of encirclement to the Soviet troops in the south, and they had to be withdrawn from the exposed position. After the main attack had tied down the Soviet reserves, the Axis forces in Romania joined the offensive. The main spearhead...
Look at how much curves that are going with the line. So basically this guy went real deep with his, discovery of what happened, what not. He probably checked every single small battle here and there, how they won and not to create these lines, because they are changing way too much. It's not a simple line that small shapes are changing. Lines are changing way too rapidly. So this guy put real effort and detail into this one.
Now made a dash towards the east, and this made Soviet command think that the main German effort was directed towards Kiev. However, the Germans had stuck to their original plan and turned south. When the Soviets realized the German intentions, it was already too late to withdraw their forces, and the Germans encircled and destroyed many of the Soviet formations near the town of Uman. The Soviets now abandoned western Ukraine and retreated to the eastern bank of the river Dnieper. They deployed the first wave of freshly mobilized troops to establish a strong defense on the river.
See, whenever you see that sign come up like this, 60,000 POWs, 100,000 POWs, right? You think, oh, prisoners of war, so they survived, they just got imprisoned. Yeah, this is basically Nazis. This is Hitler, right? As I remember correctly, I don't remember which video I watched, or was it some kind of article. Hitler killed lots of, Soviet prisoners, POWs. Basically, just, executed them or hand them to, some of the divisions to be killed or something like that. Because in the end, you need to understand, this is not some emperor trying to gain some territories, right? This is war of ideologies, I guess. Because Hitler basically thought that him and his German, civilians are Aryans, right, which are superior, and Soviet, Russian, Slavs and Jews, everybody's are subhuman. So just like how he was killing Jews by sending them into the camps and things, he was also killing POWs here. So the World War II is really fucked up than World War I, not just because of the scale and the numbers that was involved. It's because of what reason it fought for, why Hitler was fighting, or what Hitler's ideology was. The way he killed Jews, the way he killed POWs, because he thought these are not equal humans. That was just completely different shit, right? World War I happened because of the people's ego and empires. This happened because of the ideology, like some people are not as equal to us and he just killed them. That's just fucked up.
River line and also cling to the port of Odessa. At the same time, operations were being carried out in the north, where 1.5 million German soldiers from army groups north and center were facing 1 million Soviet soldiers. In the beginning of the invasion, the army group center was to encircle Soviet forces at the border and then advance towards Smolensk and Moscow. Meanwhile, Army Group North was to advance directly towards Leningrad, threatening to trap the Soviet forces between them and the sea. On June 22nd, the Germans attacked. The Soviet Western Front was deployed forward, and during the first days of the war, the German forces encircled most of its formations near.
So basically Hitler thought, I'm not just going to take Moscow, I'm also going to take St. Petersburg, Leningrad or whatever.
The towns of Bialystok and Minsk. In the Baltics, the Soviet counterattacks were defeated in the Battle of Razenia, and then they attempted to pull back and establish a defensive line on Daugava River. But the Germans reached the river before them and pushed onwards, threatening the Soviet units in the west with encirclement. At the same time, Army Group Center had finished encircling the Soviet Western Front, and its infantry units began to reduce the pockets, while its armored forces advanced eastwards almost unopposed. The Soviets attempted to plug the gap by deploying most of their pre-war reserves to counter them, but it was not enough, and as the German offensive continued, their armor broke through the Soviet lines and trapped these units near Smolensk. By that time, the first wave of Soviet mobilization was complete, and the Soviets used these formations to block further German advance and attempted to free the encircled troops. However, the performance of these newly created units was lackluster, and they were
Damn, this is really effed up. Every time I see that line, they encircle certain people because they are not retreating, they are not giving up their position, and then the line around them just ties up and gets cut off into one perfect circle, and fuck, more POWs. See, these people are gonna become POWs too, because how their flank is getting covered by the Germans.
Unable to liberate the pocket.
Oh,
the Germans managed to close it up, and
300,000.
The Germans had gained the upper hand in the central part of the front, and now they were faced with two options. They could continue the push towards Moscow immediately, or secure the flanks of Army Group Center first and then continue the offensive eastwards. They decided to do the latter, and the armored formations of Army Group Center were sent to aid neighboring army groups. During this time, battles had been raging in the north, where Army Group North had failed to pull out large encirclements, and their progress was slowed down by the Soviet counterattacks and bad infrastructure. Nevertheless, they were making slow but steady progress, and after securing their left flank, they reached the approaches to Leningrad.
They went to the sea.
When the help from Army Group Center arrived, they were able to perform the final push and cut off the land-based communications to the city. Further north, Finland had entered the war against the Soviet Union on June 25th, and the Finnish troops took advantage of the Soviet defeats by taking back the lands lost in the Winter War. After that, they established forward defensive positions between the lakes. Even further north, the Finnish and German troops attempted to capture the Soviet port city of Murmansk and cut the Murmansk railway in order to sever the Allied supply route to the Soviet Union. However, their attacks became bogged down in the rough terrain short of their objectives. The front became static. Meanwhile, the other armored units of the Army Group Center were sent to help Army Group South. The Soviets had anticipated that the Germans would continue their attack towards Moscow and
more
concentrated their
POWs.
troops on this direction, which allowed the German armored formations to push back the weaker Soviet units on their southern flank. The German advanced southwards.
Whoa, why are not Soviets realizing? Lots of people are getting trapped by, their flank. Basically retreat if need be, because people around you are retreating. That's how your flank is getting exposed. Damn, too many POWs, man. It's just like 80,000, 300,000, 100,000. Like, holy shit.
Forced the Soviets to abandon their forward positions in the Pripyat marshes to shorten their line. In Ukraine, the Soviet troops were occupying a strong defensive position with their flanks resting on the Dnieper River in the west and south and the marshes in the north. Yet, the panzers from Army Group Center were bypassing the marshes from the east and advanced into the Soviet rear. The Soviets thought that the German spearhead was overextended and could be contained. However, unbeknownst to them, the armored formations of the Army Group South had secretly crossed the Dnieper from the south into a German breachhead.
I don't know why they're not trying to go like this and trap them. Maybe it's not so. If you cross there, you give openings so they would get in. Maybe it's German forces are way too overpowering number basically. Who knows?
Now broke through towards north to link up.
Oh,
to the
no.
As the groups met, most of the Soviet units in the central Ukraine became
Whoa!
750,000 men were trapped in the pocket. When the pocket had been liquidated, the Soviet
Those are stupendous number, man. 665,000. Holy shit. In World War II, people just got captured like it's nothing. 500,000 soldiers? Yeah, sure. Give me more, I guess. More POWs. This is ridiculous.
forces in Ukraine had been severely weakened. After these operations, the flanks of Army Group Center were secure, but now the Germans didn't have enough time to reach the objectives set in the beginning of the campaign, and they decided to go for more limited goals. In order to reach them, they began a full-scale attack along the whole front. In the south, the Soviet resistance had been crippled with the recent encirclement, and this allowed the Germans to carry out another encirclement, trapping part of the Soviet forces on the coast of the Black Sea. Then they pushed onwards and established their control over the resource-rich areas of the eastern Ukraine and conquered the
Look, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't know Nazis were fan of this. This was one of the biggest tactics. Maybe it was in the Eastern Front. Basically taking the flank and taking it out so, you could trap the people. Damn, this is one of the biggest strategy they used, right? How many people they've captured so far because of this? They just basically went in like that. We are just going to, make sure that people's flanks are covered so we can take them prisoners and take them out of the equation. And they are doing that from the start. Whenever they see the chance, they just make a run for it and make sure that the people are trapped. Damn, I didn't know, Soviets were losing that badly at the start. Anybody who sees this and doesn't know the history will think like, holy shit, Soviets are done, because look at that.
Crimean Peninsula, with Soviets abandoning Odessa but clinging on to the port of Sevastopol.
For God's sake.
At the same time, the German forces were pursuing their objectives in the north. Their goal was to sever the remaining supply route to Leningrad and link up with the Finnish forces. The initial advance was successful and reached its first goal by cutting the railway line supplying the city. The main German effort was in the center. All this time the Soviets had anticipated an attack on Moscow and had deployed 1,250,000 mobilized troops to the sector. During the German operations on the flanks, they had even somewhat managed to push Army Group Center back to improve their defensive perimeter, but by the end of September, the German armor had finally returned to the center and proceeded to carry out a new attack. Once again, near the towns of Vyazma and Bryansk, the Soviet troops were encircled, and this resulted in halving the Soviet strength on the front. After reducing the pockets, the Germans closed their
right out of the bat.
Then they attempted to encircle Moscow with a two-pronged attack, but by that time the long advance had exhausted their offensive capabilities and the weather had become severely cold. The Soviets managed to halt their advance, and although they didn't have large...
I can only imagine, the Soviet generals and whoever was basically in charge on the battlefield, just seeing all the people getting captured, POWs after POWs after POWs, and somebody just comes to them, we are losing badly, should we give up? Should we, just wave the white flag? And he's like, we just have to hold on, winter is coming. Because winter has been their friend all the time, right? All the war I can think of, whether it's Napoleonic War, the Great Northern War, in this, basically World War II, winter has always been their friend.
superiority in numbers, the Soviet proficiency in winter combat allowed them to carry out a counterattack.
Look
The
at that
Germans
shit.
were
As soon
forced
as winter came, the tide literally changed. Until now, Nazis were pushing in. As soon as winter came, they are pushing back.
to abandon their vulnerable forward positions on the flanks and pulled back in order to shorten the front line. During the retreat, they had to abandon some of their heavy equipment. At the same time, the German attempt to cut off Leningrad had also failed, and they had to retreat to their starting positions, and the supply line to Leningrad was restored. In the south, the German advance was also checked by the Soviets, forcing the Germans to abandon their forward positions in Rostov. The first year of the war was over. The Soviets had stopped the Germans far from their initial goals, but at the great cost to their own military capabilities. The Red Army had been decimated, and it would take a year or more to fully rebuild and re-equip the army. The Germans wanted to use this window of opportunity and were sending most of their available forces to the Eastern Front to deliver a knockout punch in the following year. 1942 would be the decisive year of the war.
Yeah. Damn. This is why, basically in Russia, there are more women than men, right? Because lots of people died in World War II. I mean, look at that, the POWs. How many POWs, man? Even the last attack where they had 1.2 million, Russians had Soviets had 1.2 million, but Germans had about 2 million people. Even then, as soon as the war battle started, they just took 2-3 POW areas like it's nothing, right? 500,000 or 1 million people just like that. Damn, too many POWs. But yeah, as soon as the winter came, that's it. Tide changed. I mean, that's the trend I've been seeing, for centuries. That's been the trend of Russia, Soviet Union, whenever the winter comes, that's it. Alright, people, that was Eastern Front of World War II animated 1941. Seriously, I mean, the guy put so much effort into this, right? The lines were moving way too much because he put that much detail in. He just tracked which battle, even at the smallest town, who won and who didn't at when time. So that was great.
In 1941, the Axis invaded the Soviet Union, planning to overrun the
Wait a second, audio is a bit low. Oh, there you go.
European part of it before the onset of winter. However, the resistance was stronger than expected, and by the beginning of October, they had expended much of their offensive capabilities. Assuming that the Red Army was on the brink of collapse, they launched an all-out attack. The Soviet Union had still resources left, and the Axis forces found themselves overextended. The Red Army was seriously weakened, but it did not let the opportunity slip.
See, the thing is here, Stalin led the country at the time and probably didn't have many generals, experienced generals who could do this, because every time these German forces suddenly all out just spearheads inside the enemy territory, right? Surprise attack, just trying to force their way in. Like, this force is right here. They suddenly try to push inside. That would easily clear their flanks, right? So Russian could, create some kind of a strategy where they would try to trap them. Because that's why, in any battlefield, people don't suddenly try to surge forward, right? Any one part of the army. Because that would basically open the flanks where people could trap you. So they could have tried something like that as soon as they push forwards, because not everybody's not pushing forward, only this side, maybe this side, they are suddenly pushing forward. And that opens the gaps like this. They didn't capitalize on that. This happened in, previous video too. They were just suddenly attacking and flanks were open, but yet they were not trying to trap them.
And counterattacked with all available forces, forcing the Axis into a retreat. In the Black Sea region, the Soviets undertook an amphibious operation. They landed their forces in the Crimea, survived the Axis counterattack, and made preparations to take the whole peninsula. In Ukraine, they pushed towards the Dnieper River and managed to gain ground before their attack was contained. Near Leningrad, the Red Army broke a breach into the German line and pushed into their rear, threatening to unhinge their front. The Soviets concentrated most of their forces against the Army Group center. After having pulled back from the approaches of Moscow, the Germans decided to stand fast and regroup on their present positions. This gave the Red Army a chance to conduct an encirclement of the German forces. Overextension had created several gaps in the German lines, and Red Army exploited them in order to bypass and cut off the German units. Despite of moving behind the German lines, they did not have enough strength to cut the main railway supplying the German forces, and the Germans were able to cut off and contain the breakthroughs. In the north, the Soviets encircled the German Second Corps at Demyansk, but it was sustained by air supply. After realizing that it lacked the strength to conduct a major attack, the Red Army concentrated its efforts on the most promising.
Okay, I was just about to say why he's saying traps and not POWs, because they're not POWs, they're still fighting. And Germans are supporting them with air. Oh, look at the differences, man. Difference between two armies.
Sectors. However, by this time the Germans had secured their position and the attacks achieved only minimal progress. After having reorganized further, the Germans were able to conduct small offensives of their own in the most critical sectors. They destroyed some Soviet units in the Army Group Center's rear and re-established a land connection with the Demyansk pocket. As the winter ended, both sides drew up their plans for the summer. The Soviets were rebuilding the Red
Look at that, Soviets are holding out too. That's a Soviet, right? That's a Soviet side.
Army, but it would be far from ready by summer and the Axis would still have the upper hand. The Soviets believed the Axis would use this to undertake a major offensive towards Moscow and prepared to take a defensive stance. The question was what to do with the many salients that had been formed in the front. They provided good opportunities for the encirclement of both the Axis and Soviet units and were difficult to defend. In order to conduct a successful defense, they would have to be eliminated. One option was to abandon the salients, the other was to destroy the Axis-held salients. Although it was not clear if the Red Army would have enough strength to do so, they decided to risk it. They would destroy the Axis forces in...
Okay, first of all, Germans are fighting on both sides, like Western Front and Eastern Front. So their forces are kind of, there has to be some forces here, if not the, most, because they diverted all into the Eastern Front. But Soviets are not fighting anything in their east side. So why are not they just, taking all of the soldiers and, put them on the border? They would definitely overwhelm the Nazis, right?
Vulnerable positions, and this would drain the strength from the main Axis attack. After the main attack was repelled, the build-up of the Red Army would have
there you go, now they are joining in. They should have just sent them from the start.
Reached a level that would allow it to go on a major offensive. The Germans were indeed preparing to carry out a major attack. Comparing with the previous year, their resources had decreased and they were unable to mount a large Barbarossa-style offensive. Instead, they planned to undertake several consecutive offensives in order to destroy the Soviet Union. As the first step, they would capture the Caucasus oil fields in order to deny the Soviet Union most of their oil supply and gain a long-term source of it themselves. This would allow the Germans to continue waging the war in full capacity. Next, Leningrad would be taken, and then the Murmansk Railroad would be cut, depriving the Soviet Union of its main sources of foreign aid. Meanwhile, in the center, the German forces would hold their forward positions in order to provide a good springboard for an offensive. After the Red Army had been...
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. This German plan makes sense. The way how things were going for the Nazis and how Hitler was at the time. They wanted resources first, so they would attack resources area first and hold line everywhere else. As soon as they gain their resources, right? Like, okay, we have oil and all the resources we need. Now they can, think about greater plan to basically attack Soviet Union more deeper.
Weakened by previous steps and the Axis had freed up their forces, they would occupy the main Soviet industrial base in central Russia. Before and during the main operations, the Axis would clear out as many of the contested areas as possible to free up more troops. The first Soviet attack was in the north, where they attempted to push the Axis forces back in order to increase the security of the Murmansk Railroad, but they failed to make any serious advances in the rough terrain and went on a defensive. The next operation was meant to destroy the most vulnerable German salient at Demyansk, but the Germans continued to hold on to their positions and their progress was minimal. The next operation was undertaken by the Axis in the southernmost part of the front. In the Crimea, the open steppe suited well for close air support and the Germans used it to break through the Soviet lines. The Red Army had previously conducted several offensives and its forces were deployed forward, lacking the depth to contain the Axis breakthrough. The Soviets were unable to stop the Axis advance and had to abandon the peninsula.
How many 170,000 POWs like that? Holy shit, look at the numbers, man. Right? Just few centuries ago, these are the numbers people used to fight entire wars. This is the whole army. Look at in World War II, 170,000 is like nothing. Yeah, it's just another POWs, group. We just took 300,000 before, 60,000 before, why not?
In Ukraine, the Soviets had finished their preparations first and went on the offensive, attempting to take Kharkov with a two-pronged attack. The Axis forces were not far behind in their deployment, and 5 days after the beginning of the Soviet attack, they went on an offensive of their own. The Red Army did not anticipate such a move, and the German units managed to cut off the attacking Soviet troops and
you
destroy
kidding me? Holy shit. Germans like that is their main strategy. Just trap them. Closing the flanks. Why are Soviet going like, okay, this is the second year, this shit is happening. Doesn't matter what you do. Doesn't matter if you don't gain any areas. Make sure that your flanks are secure, because this is just ridiculous. 250,000 POWs.
In the north, near Leningrad, the Soviets were unable to fully exploit their breakthrough. Having realized the vulnerability of their...
Look at this shit. Why is this flank open? Just go back a bit if need be, because this can easily, they could cut you off, I guess.
...position, they decided to evacuate the salient. However, the Germans beat them to it and cut the neck of the salient. During the next month, the encircled Soviet forces were eliminated. In the center, both the Soviets and the Germans were preparing their own offensives. As the German operation was of smaller scale, it was ready first, and they proceeded to clear out the pocket south of the railroad. Soon, they had full control over the territory, although part of the Soviet forces managed to escape and reach their main lines. After having regrouped their forces, they turned against the northern salient. They cut its communications with the main Soviet front and pushed into it, eliminating most of the Soviet units. Destruction of the Red Army formations behind the Germans.
Oh god, how many Soviets died in the Eastern Front? Holy shit. First of all POWs are basically, most of them going to die. The treatment, how Nazis did. And some of them they just point blank just killed here.
German lines forced a change in the Soviet plans, and their offensive in the center was postponed. In the south, the failure of the Kharkov offensive had left the Red Army in disarray, and the Germans decided to exploit the opportunity. They conducted 2 smaller attacks, but this time the Soviets pulled their forces back and did not offer strong resistance. The amount of prisoners taken was limited.
Come on.
Now everything was ready to carry out.
POWs are making me crazy. Holy shit, man. How about Soviet take German POWs for fuck's sake? How overpowered Nazis were, man. Here, they're just basically, any reason Russia hold out is because of their numbers, I think. Because so far Nazis been way too powerful.
Out the German plan to capture the Caucasus. As the first step, the Axis forces would encircle and destroy the Soviet formations on their southern flank. Then they would advance and take strong defensive positions along the Volga and Don rivers to cut the communications between the Soviet heartland and the Caucasus. This would shield the Axis forces in the south from the main force of the Red Army. As the third step, the Axis forces would move into the Caucasus and take over the oil fields. The first German attack reached the Don River as planned. The Soviets expected that they would turn north towards Moscow and deployed their reserves, conducting a counterattack from this direction. In the south, the Red Army began to withdraw to avoid encirclement. Because the German plan was founded on the assumption that the Soviets would avoid retreat, as they had done in the previous year, they were now confronted with the possibility of Soviet forces escaping the encirclement. They altered the plan, sending the forces
Nazis with a Pikachu face. They'll learn something from previous year. They are not taking the bait. We can't encircle them. Of course you can't, because there's they can notice that so many people are not here anymore. Thousands and thousands and even millions basically are not around because they all got trapped.
Immediately to the south in order to catch the Soviet units. However, the Soviet formations further south joined the...
Okay, how the fuck that unit can just walk like that? Is that a Panzer unit? What is that? What doesn't matter what it is. Why can't they just trap them? Their flank is just open.
Retreat, allowing most of them to escape the encirclement. By this time, the Soviet command had understood the German intentions and had deployed their strategic reserves to keep the Axis away from the Volga River. Meanwhile, their other forces retreated south over the Don. During that time, the Germans had also captured Sevastopol, and when it was clear that the Caucasus direction was properly covered, they sent the freed up forces north to take Leningrad. In the central part of the front, the Germans were finishing the preparations to destroy another Soviet salient, but before that, the Red Army had finished deployment and commenced its offensive against the Army Group center. The Germans reinforced the defenses and then attempted to cut the southern Soviet salient with weaker forces, but were unable to. The terrain in the area of the Soviet attack was not suitable for the use of heavy weapons, and the main brunt of the fighting fell to the infantry, which suffered heavy casualties. Despite pushing the Germans back, they were unable to destroy their...
Okay, there are no Germans here, only one unit? What the fuck? And why are they all standing there? Why can't they just encircle them here?
their forces. Limited attacks continued for a month more, but they failed to secure more territory. In the north, the Germans planned to use reinforcements from the Crimea to cut off Leningrad. In addition, they planned to undertake several operations in order to improve their defensive positions. The Red Army was meanwhile preparing to re-establish the land connection to Leningrad by pushing through the thin strip of the German-held territory. The Soviets attacked first, and the Germans had to use the reserves to repel them. The defense tied up their forces, and they lost the time they needed for the encirclement of Leningrad. In addition, they could spare enough troops only to widen the neck of the Demyansk salient. In the south, the Axis had failed to destroy the Soviet formations opposing them, but in the same time, the quick retreat had thrown the Soviet forces into disarray, putting them in need of reorganization. Meanwhile, the Axis troops were left unscathed. The Germans decided to solve the situation by not allowing the remaining Soviet units to reorganize and moved immediately towards the Caucasus, while the other part of their forces would secure the flank. The Soviet forces continued their retreat until they reached the Caucasus Mountains. There they made a stand and dug in on the bottlenecks. In the north, the Germans used the open steppe terrain to outmaneuver the Soviet reserves and moved slowly towards Volga. By the end of August, they had reached the river and entered the city of Stalingrad and began to slowly clear out the city. In the Caucasus, the German Alpine troops traversed the mountain passes, but
I guess now one of the most bloodiest battle ever is gonna come, I guess. Stalingrad, right? Holy shit. So Stalingrad is where everything turned around as far as I can remember.
They lacked the strength to reach the sea and were stopped on the southern slopes. During the following months, the spread out Axis forces continued to make small gains. Although the Axis had made serious advances, they were unable to deliver a crippling blow to the Soviet war effort and decided to complete their objectives in the next year. They anticipated that the Soviets would have enough strength for a winter offensive in one sector and that they would attempt to destroy the salient in the central part of the front. The Germans countered the threat by deploying their reserves. Meanwhile, in the south, the Axis forces attempted to improve their positions as much as possible before the onset of winter. They tried to cut off the Red Army units in the Black Sea coast, but they could not break through the hills. In the central Caucasus, the Germans caught the Red Army off balance and moved deep into the hills until the Soviets redeployed their units. After that, coming of the winter snow put an end to the offensives in the Caucasus. By the Volga, the Axis forces had advanced steadily during the last months, and in the middle of November, they were in the process of removing the last Soviet presence in Stalingrad. They were not expecting a major attack in the south, and instead of creating a defense in depth, the forces of the Axis flank were deployed offensively, concentrated in the east at the point of effort. In this situation, the Soviet breachheads over the Don were considered of secondary importance and were covered by Romanian forces, who lacked anti-tank equipment and were not keen on fighting. Contrary to German estimations, the Red Army had the forces to conduct 2 winter offensives. They had deployed their second force in the south to make full use of the Axis.
Look at that, it's just 450,000 German versus 1.1 million Soviets. And still Germans are overpowering.
Deployment in this sector. The Red Army managed to achieve surprise and overran the Romanian forces opposing them. Then they broke into the undefended Axis rear, cutting off their forward units. Next, they had planned to reach the sea and cut off all the Axis forces in the Caucasus region. However, some of the Red Army forces had to be diverted to repel the German attempt to relieve the Stalingrad pocket, and the advance could not be conducted to full extent. The year in the south ended with the Soviets crushing all Axis hopes to sustain their forces.
I'm waiting for this thing to say POWs, because I really want to see Nazi POWs now, because this has been ridiculous. Soviet POWs was driving me crazy. Every time, 50,000, 60,000. At least take 5,000 of Germans, man, come on.
In the Caucasus and Stalingrad, and were threatening to advance into Ukraine. At the same time, the Red Army was attempting to cut the German salient in the center. The Germans had deployed their reserves and were prepared for the attack.
It's twice.
The Soviet attacks were met with staunch defense, and where they were able to penetrate the German defenses, they were thrown back by counterattacks. The Soviet offensive failed to achieve its objectives, and only in the western sector did the Red Army achieve some success. Thus, 1942 came to an end. The Soviets had secured the oil, and now the Wehrmacht lacked a proper plan to defeat the Soviet Union. The Soviet forces were moving west with the hope to inflict a decisive defeat on the Axis. At the same time, the Germans attempted to save the situation and create a stalemate. Whether they are successful will be decided in the next year. There is another question. How could I animate so many divisions? Well, I couldn't have done this without my patrons on Patreon, and I would.
Yeah. Yeah, people, go to the original video page link and support the channel from there. Damn, I mean, I love the Stalingrad thing in the end that happened. They're just like, oh, hell no, just, encircle the Nazis. They tried to help them, couldn't do it. But it's not POW. I think they're still holding out yet, right? But I guess Stalin just thought, you know what? I'm going to let everything go, but not my city. It's named Stalingrad. We make a stand here. So that's where everything's going to change, I guess. The trapped Nazi army, are they going to turn into POWs or what? We'll see it in the next video, I guess. Damn, I'm loving this series so far. This channel is awesome. All the small details here and there. Those POWs were making me crazy every time. Soviet POWs. No wonder I saw that Fallen of the World War II video in that so many Soviet and Russians died. It's not surprising after seeing something like this.
In the last months of 1942, the German forces were encircled at Stalingrad. At first, the Germans hoped to reverse the situation by relieving the pocket and maintaining it by air supply. However, as 1943 began, the Germans were forced to abandon their plans to relieve the city and were pushed back from its approaches. Despite that, they ordered their troops in Stalingrad to hold out as long as possible in order to tie up Soviet units and buy time. The advance of the Red Army created the possibility of the German troops in the Caucasus to be cut off. They ordered a full withdrawal from the region while their forces in the north kept the path of retreat open. The main effort of the Red Army was, however, directed against the Hungarian and Italian units on the northern flank. Their lightly equipped forces were unable to hold the line and were forced into a harsh winter retreat. Most of them lost their combat capabilities or were destroyed, leaving a large gap in the Axis lines.
Whoa!
The German units in the north had also to retreat, but they were able to keep their battle-worthiness intact. At the same time, the Germans managed to pull back part of their forces from the Caucasus. The remaining troops formed a breachhead on the coast to retain the opportunity for a summer push towards the oil fields. During January, both sides had their full attention set on the southern sector. The lack of the German reserves allowed the Red Army to achieve two small but significant victories. They re-established a land connection to Leningrad, and in the central part of the front, they captured the railway junction of Veliki Luki. For the Axis, the situation in the south continued to deteriorate. The German troops in Stalingrad surrendered, freeing up significant numbers of Soviet units.
Damn.
The Red Army forces moving west into the
Things are turning around in this video, right? Now German POWs are the one, who being caught.
Ukraine were not very formidable, but the large gap in the Axis line left them little opposition. The Soviet command decided to exploit this opportunity and attempted to cut off almost all of the army group south. In response, the Germans used the forces retreating from the Caucasus to extend their front eastwards and pulled their main force west. The Red Army moved further west to bypass their line and encircle them, but this overextended their forces. The Germans counterattacked from two sides and disorganized their forward detachments. Having caught the Soviet southern flank off...
See, that's the thing. Soviets cannot just immediately run behind and cut off the German forces who are in the south area where the oil fields are, right? Because that would basically mean that they would make sure the line is now thin because they moved way too forward. That gives Germans easier way to, I guess, trap them like they have been doing for so long. So you cannot leave your flank open now, even though it would be advantageous for you, right? Like, cutting them off in the south would mean a massive victory for Soviets. You can't take that risk even because Nazis are really unpredictable, right? They would trap you if you just give them chance. So you can't leave your flank open like that.
Balance. The Germans now wanted to push in both from north and south at the same time, destroying the whole Soviet force. They began to muster their units for the northern attack. In the south, their troops continued onwards, retaking Kharkov. But in the north, they failed to concentrate a force sufficient for the attack, though they were able to stop the Red Army's advance. By this time, both the Soviets and the Germans had exhausted their forces and went on defensive. As the fighting in the south had drawn all German reinforcements, the Red Army prepared to launch a major offensive in the north and center. The Germans realized the danger and responded by abandoning their most vulnerable positions before the Soviets had finished deployment, and the attacks that took place failed to achieve their goals. Being confronted with a much stronger German line, the Red Army abandoned its offensive plans and the Eastern Front became quiet. With the end of the winter campaign, the Axis had lost the capabilities necessary to knock the Soviet Union out of the war by capturing the areas vital for its war effort. Now they planned to win through attrition by holding on to the occupied areas and inflicting vast casualties to the attacking Red Army. In this way, they could drain the areas remaining under the Soviet control dry of resources and create a stalemate. The Red Army, on the other hand, set out to take back the economic...
Yeah, so now Nazis basically are in the defensive mode, which they didn't want it from the start. They wanted those areas and resources, but now they have no choice but to be defensive mode, right? Kill as many people as you can and create a stalemate. Otherwise, Soviets push in, come close to the Germany now.
Vital western lands of the Soviet Union, which would give it a strategic advantage. However, this time they would play it safe. Their previous offensives had been threatened by the German armored counterattacks, and this time they decided to receive them on prepared defenses. At the same time, with building up the fortifications, the Red Army formed a massive offensive force. As part of their defense strategy, the Germans planned a number of limited offensives to encircle Soviet forces and shorten their defensive line. The most promising of these was the encirclement of the Soviet units in the Kursk salient. It took 3 months for the German build-up to match the gradually improved Soviet defense.
Okay, what was the population of Russia and Soviet Union around this time? 70-80 million at best? I don't know. I think that would be their number, right? Russia is right now 70-80 million or 60 million, something like that. So 7 million people. That's a lot of number. And lots of million also got captured and died. Let's not forget about that.
And in the beginning of July, they launched their attack. The Germans made some headway, but were ultimately stopped dead in the depth of the Soviet defenses. Having for the time tied up the strongest German armored units, the Red Army now released its forces for the offensive. The attacks were to be carried out in consecutive stages along several sectors of the front. First, the Red Army struck into the rear of the German troops north of Kursk. Being unable to contain the attack and wishing to avoid the danger of encirclement, the Germans began the process of evacuating the salient. At the same time, the Red Army launched an attack in the south.
This is ridiculous. Look at their units and look at this Russians unit. Holy shit. Soviets, whatever.
The Germans redeployed their forces and contained it. By this time, the Soviet units south of Kursk had finished reorganization and pushed towards Kharkov. The Germans redeployed their forces to the sector but failed to hold the city, though succeeded in temporarily containing the Soviet advance. The situation in the north was more under the German control. The Red Army failed to break through the German defenses near Smolensk. At the same time, the Germans had finished their withdrawal to the new line, strengthening their positions further. By this time, the Germans had been able to maintain the balance and check the Red Army's attacks. However, the renewal of the Soviet offensive near the sea broke the German line and forced them into a large-scale retreat. Even more, the concurrent offensive against the lightly fortified German positions on the former western edge of the Kursk salient resulted in a breakthrough the Germans weren't able to contain.
Yeah, there's so
many
people.
They now realized that they lacked the troops necessary to contain the Soviets in their present line and ordered a retreat to a much better defendable Panther-Wotan position that was centered around the Dnieper River and its tributaries. At the same time, the Soviet breakthrough near Smolensk hastened the retreat of Army Group Center. With the German forces taking a stronger defensive position, the Red Army had to concentrate its main effort on a shorter section of the front. They decided to make regaining western Ukraine the main priority. First, however, we'll take a look at the central part of the front, where the Red Army had outrun the Germans to the Dnieper and had established a breachhead on the junctions of the Army Group Center and South. They planned to trap the whole Army Group Center by combined strikes from the breachhead and from a breakthrough in the north, while the other forces would pin the Germans in place. In October, while part of the Red Army was still recovering from the pursuit, battles were fought in order to secure the breachhead.
This is, a completely different Red Army, right? From the start of this series, because at the start they were losing so badly, they were getting captured so much, like they're amateur or something. Now suddenly they're doing all these tactics. They'll learn things like how Nazis are doing, how Nazis are basically, closing their flanks and capturing them. This army they're fighting right now is feel completely different than the start of it.
Meanwhile, the other forces began creating a breach in the northern part of the front. With their main focus being in the south, the Red Army had established several breachheads over the Dnieper in Ukraine. After they had got their heavy equipment over the river, they attempted local breakouts, first of which took place in the south. The Germans were able to contain it. Then the Soviets broke through the German land front, severing their connection with the Crimea. They proceeded with another breakout attempt near Kiev, but the Germans redeployed their troops and pushed it back towards the river. Having not fully succeeded in the breakouts, the Red Army adopted a more systematic approach, slowly but surely expanding its breachheads and massing troops for a larger breakout. In the center, the Red Army was now better prepared, which allowed it to increase the pressure. It resulted in a breakthrough in the north. The Germans held on to the flanks in the hopes of conducting a counterattack and cutting the Soviet forces off. Then the Soviets launched their main attack from the southern breachhead. It broke through the lines and gained limited success, though it failed to achieve its objective. The Germans were able to prevent a deeper breakthrough by abandoning territory and pulling back their front line. As 1943...
Germans are like wolves, right? As soon as someone try to break through it, they suddenly go in the sides, like about to flank them or something, like trap them. Every time I see that, it's, suddenly Soviets push forward really fast. They suddenly go to sides like I'm going to trap them. And that's the tactics.
Indeed, the Red Army was ready for the winter offensive, which would encompass the whole Soviet-German front. In Ukraine, the Germans had concentrated their defenses in the Great Bend of the Dnieper. This allowed the Red Army to catch them off balance by mounting a breakout from the Kiev breachhead. The Germans managed to contain their advance only with great difficulties. They wanted to keep their last position near the Dnieper River as a staging area for a possible counterattack and did not evacuate it despite the evident threat. The Red Army exploited this by cutting the salient off with a two-pronged attack. The Germans launched a rescue attempt and were able to retrieve part of the encircled forces, but without their heavy equipment. With the German attention directed towards the pocket, the Soviet forces launched attacks on the flanks, threatening to sever the connection between the army groups south and center. Meanwhile, Soviet troops were continuing with their attempt to encircle Army Group Center itself. In the north, the Germans realized they lacked the force to cut off the Red Army's breakthrough and abandoned the exposed salients. The Red Army now attempted to encircle the town of Vitebsk, but it was not met with success. Most of the Red Army's offensive assets were deployed in the south, and as a result, the goals of the Soviet forces in the center proved to be beyond the means to achieve them. The offensives took limited territory at the price of large casualties and were eventually abandoned. During the summer, the Soviet pressure on the army...
Yeah, so see, I've reacted to lots of historical videos like Napoleonic Wars and things. So if some kind of that kind of war, like I could say, Alexander the Great, like, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, somebody like that, that the people are running around with horses, phalanx, and swords and shit. This is World War II. There are tanks, there are planes. So all you're seeing is this massive scale. There are lots of tanks basically. So every line, there are tank warfare going around the town. Towns are crumbling down because of tanks shooting left and right, both sides, right? There's a massive tank warfare. Tanks are used like they're soldiers or something. Lots of tanks running around, thousands of tanks, right? In the previous video, I don't know, maybe it was, in extra history video, right? Battle of Kursk. He said there was a massive, 4,000 or 5,000 tanks coming towards them, like a massive line of tanks coming towards the enemy. So this is just ridiculous. Imagining all that, like all this is happening, and everywhere there are tanks. Tanks are hitting everything. There are planes in the skies. Holy shit, this war was just ridiculous.
Army Group North had not been as strong as against the other army groups, and the Germans had dispatched a lot of its strength to other fronts. Despite its greatly reduced strength, the army group had not withdrawn to the shorter line and still held its forward positions. The Red Army attempted to encircle part of the German forces during the winter offensive. The Germans evaded the encirclement and then attempted to resist on the new positions, but they lacked the strength to do so, and it was decided to withdraw to the Panther Line. Both armies settled on the new line, and during the remaining part of the winter, the Red Army undertook only some limited attacks in order to probe the German defenses. The Red Army was planning to achieve its main success in the south. During the preceding half-year, the Soviet forces were slowly but steadily consolidating their positions on the west bank of the Dnieper, and by the beginning of March, this process was complete. The German Army Group South was by then pushed into the open plains and did not...
they are just 364,000 against 1.5 million Soviets, and they're still holding the line. What the fuck?
...retreat behind any other natural obstacle, leaving it vulnerable. The Soviets...
Yeah, that's like, near 5 times as more people. 4 or 5 times. So this is just ridiculous. You have to be really, good, soldiers on the field, right? With your experienced troops and everything. Tanks. Obviously the Tiger tanks had double the Tigers, and Panthers had double the range of the Soviet tanks. So there are lots of elements at play here. But look at that. 364,000 versus 1.5 million. They're still holding the line. In any time you would think that if that much of a difference there is, they would basically push them back all the way to Germany. But they can't do here because that's how effed up Nazis were. And they were fighting really, really hard because, like I've said in lots of videos, this is not just about like in World War I. This is not just about territories. Like some people want some other territories. It's about the countries. No, this is about ideologies. Nazism versus communism. And ideologies is like kind of like religion. They are really strong in people's mind. Right, in a Battle of Kursk video in Extra History, we saw one SS officer just drop his pen for whatever reason. There was an issue there, and ran naked into the enemy. That's how committed he was. This is just fucked up.
Wanted to pin the whole army group to the Carpathian Mountains or the Black Sea and destroy it. The Axis were unable to resist the Soviet tank armies and the whole front fell back. Near the Black Sea they began pulling back their forces, but in the west the Red Army encircled several German corps. The Soviets made the mistake by expecting the Germans to retreat southwards, which allowed them to extract most of the trapped force.
See, that's what I'm talking about. This is the second time this has happened in just past few minutes of the video. They capture German POWs and they somehow escapes. How powerful you have to be to do that? Imagine if Germans somehow had time to prepare for the war, right, for a few years, rather than how Hitler suddenly started the campaign, thinking I'll attack everybody. Maybe he was a bit more conniving, right? Maybe he was like Bismarck somewhat, thinking a bit ahead. And, he gathered troops and, slowly took over countries before people realized that he's trying to take everything. And by then, Germany is way too big and too many troops. How fucked up that would have been. Right now, he's really outnumbered and still this is happening.
Back to their front lines. Then the Red Army captured the Crimea as the last operation of the winter campaign. The Soviet Union had taken back its most economically valuable lands and gained the resources it needed to defeat Germany completely. However, with the front being still more close to Moscow than Berlin, the question was, how long shall it take? The Germans, meanwhile, had other problems to deal with. The Western Allies had landed in Italy and were preparing to do the same in France. The race to Berlin was on.
Yeah, but that's the issue with Soviet Union and Russia in general. The Moscow is very close to the enemy lines than not. That's why in Soviet Union they took some of the countries around Moscow, so there is more ground. If some other countries try to invade them, they can't just walk into Moscow because there is a ground in between them for them to prepare. So Moscow is already closer to the border, but damn, it's like Nazis push didn't matter because they're back to where they started. But now since they played all their cards, people know what they're about, right? Now Soviets will basically push on all the way to Berlin, and obviously in the Western Front, Normandy and everything, they will push towards Berlin too and encircle the Nazi. There you go, the end. If you summarize the entire World War II in the Nazi side, basically Hitler was way too quick to show aggression to everyone, right? He thought that by taking one by one territory he's going to take everyone, like he has time to think and breathe between taking over places. This like he's in some 15th or 16th century. No, this is 20th century, right? If you attack at this global scale and this speed of using tanks and things, people will take notice and this would happen. So, if he had, slowly taken over countries by countries, right, breaking treaties and things, just biding times and creating a massive land area, then he suddenly attacked like he did Paris and everything. Maybe he would have more chances. But even then, you can't attack the whole world, right? UK, USA, most countries would join in eventually because not everybody wants to speak. Not everybody wants to be Aryan. And he didn't want to convert people into Aryan. He wanted to kill people who are lesser race, like he did with the Jews. He would have done the same thing with the Soviets. He did do that with POWs. This was just fucked up from the start. Alright, well, that was Eastern Front World War II animated 1943-1944 by the channel Eastory. If you like my reaction, don't forget to like, subscribe, check out the Rick Sunday. There's a link in the description. Check out the cards for play, check out the cards in. Yeah, I'll see you next time.